So that would be the second approach. You just look at what analysts do. If you're, of course, you could always do your own estimate, right? But you can either use statistics, kind of estimate the growth rate from the past and extrapolate that, or rely on what experts say. Right, so these analysts here and investment banks only hire basically experienced people for this, right? Usually people who work in the industry for about 10, 20 years and kind of know what the business model is, know what the cash flows is. So if you're interested in becoming an analyst, it's pretty difficult as a graduate student without work experience to enter this kind of this field of work. So most people of them are kind of have a long time of industry experience. So they have the insights to kind of figure out how the overall industry is doing, how different companies compare to each other, and to properly estimate cash flows from that. Right, so that's a skill that you can't just learn as an outsider. So you have to be part of the industry for some time to understand. Right, so that will be kind of a source of data, and you can look up these analyst estimates basically from any financial website. If you want to do kind of in your master thesis research on this, for example, how analysts or like companies compare to analyst estimates or how good analyst estimates are, there is a database that's called IBIS. So, database of analyst estimates. It's called IBIS. And they have a whole history also of these values, right? So you can go back in time and look at what analysts estimated. There's a little bit of a kind of a controversy or a scandal around this because there is like research data sets are often include errors, and then the database providers rely on the researchers who work with the database reporting the errors and then correcting them. So what the database provider here did was they gave the analysts the right to clean up their own data. Right, so what does the analyst do? Well, they went back in time and changed their recommendations to just look better. Right, so they went back in time, okay, 2 years ago I recommended selling the stock, but it actually went through the roof, so I just delete that entry and put in that I actually recommended it. That must have been an error back then, right? So they manipulated the database in hindsight. And it was actually a researcher who did snapshots of the database every month and then saw like how they changed this. Then the database provider wanted to sue the researcher. It was actually Alex Lundquist from New York University. And they threatened to sue him. So he kind of wrote a paper very kind of defensively, and he called it non-random changes in databases. Right? So he didn't use the word manipulate, but he was very, very careful to not get sued by the company. Right. But still, it's a nice data set that you can work with in kind of for master thesis. For example, if you want to do an event study, what happens with the share price if they beat their analyst estimates? It would, at the reporting date, when they report their earnings, you would not just look at are the earnings good or bad. So how do you evaluate that? Well, do they beat the analyst estimates? That would be good news. And if they are below the analyst estimates, that's negative news. Then you can look at what happens to the share price on that day. It's a very typical kind of research design for an event study. Unfortunately, we don't have access here, but some people get through internships, or if you go to other schools, like Humboldt University, there's a data center that you can access, for example, as students for Bloomberg Terminal and so on. I'm pretty sure that Bloomberg has most of the data as well. Good. So I may just use here this approach, but we can play around a little bit with the numbers. Now let's think about the growth rate. So question is, what kind of growth trend here is more representative? If you just go by this from a statistical point of view, you would probably look at the standard trend here and rather use the last 10 years of data. Well, it's actually a choice that you have to make, right? So none of this is like 100% right or 100% wrong. I just want to kind of highlight here what the real-world problems in estimating these parameters are, and that you probably rather get reliably a range of values rather than one exact number. So the growth rate that I'm going to use is probably the 3.1% here. Right, so I would estimate the next dividend as 3.4, that's my last dividend. multiplied with 1 plus 3.1%. Just did a little spreadsheet here, so that would give me 3.51 euros.
So we take the rate for the last 10 years because the growth was stable the last 10 years?
Exactly. So it just looks like if you, yeah, it's a forecasting problem, but again, if you feel more comfortable to use a longer time series, that's not wrong, right? You can do that if you decide to do that. I just think that if you look at these pictures and maybe having back in mind what the analysts say, that this trend over the last 10 years might be kind of
more realistic
or representative. It's a decision that we have to make. Right?
So, do we need to consider the economics or the financial situation? Since you can see on at 2009, there was a global crisis.
Mm-hmm.
That might be a problem because of that. So we need to consider the economics as well when we're computing or we're analyzing the share price.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this is a simplified model where you have just one single growth rate. What you would do in real life is that you would split it up into different time windows. So the typical way to do this will be to have probably 3 time periods. So that's today. So the first time period, and that's usually 5 years or so, will be a detailed planning period. So you will look at kind of what exactly is the current economic situation, how do I expect the revenues, the costs and the earnings, the cash flows of the company to develop. So this would be like a detailed planning. Now, the further you go to the future, the more difficult it is to estimate these values. So a good way to kind of solve the problem is to basically do this first period individually for every company, and then do the next 5 years or 10 years for the industry overall. Because in the long run, like the average chemical company will grow on average like the chemical industry, the sector, right? So here you would have an industry estimate. And then if you go even further out in the future, in the long run, basically every company will grow on average like the GDP, right? You can't outgrow your GDP. At one point, you will be 100% of the GDP, and then you will grow exactly the same way. You cannot outgrow the GDP in the long run, even if you're Google, Apple, Tesla, or whatnot. In the long run, your growth rates will come down to GDP growth rates. Right? So this here would be basically your global GDP growth rate. Right. So you split up your valuation problems into 3 things. A very individual detailed planning period where you probably can forecast quite reliably what's going to happen over the next 1, 2, 3 years. Then you would continue with industry growth rates, and then in the long run you would use GDP growth rates. Right. So that makes it more realistic. Right. So of course this here is a very blunt kind of average, long-term average that we have. And it's not accounting for this. But of course you can make these things much more complicated. And you saw what the quantities are that the analysts estimated, right? It not only went for the dividend, but kind of every balance sheet position, revenues, costs, and so on. Even in the business, on a segment-by-segment basis, like agricultural business, chemical business, pharmaceutical business, and so on. Right? So they do this much, much more detailed than we're doing here.
So they do it specifically industry-wise? Each industry got their different aspects, right? To consider it,
Yes.
right?
Right, so you typically an analyst covers just a small amount of companies, something between 5 and 10. It's industry specific. So, and even when they do their recommendations, there are several things that they recommend. First of all, they have to determine, is the industry that I look at outperforming the general market, yes or no? So that would be the first thing. And then, usually it's made on an absolute basis. Do I beat the market, yes or no? And then the next decision is that they basically do a ranking of the companies within their industry. And they have a certain distribution that is kind of given by the investment banks. You can only, so usually the statements are overweight or buy, neutral, underweight or sell. Right? And then they say, okay, you can only, if you have 10 companies, only 2 of them can be overweight, and 2 of them, or 3 of them can be kind of buy, and 3 of them must be sell. So they
have that kind of restrictions.
Exactly. So they enforce a distribution. So you have to make up your mind which are your top companies and which are your bottom companies. Right. And that's also the thing that the analysts are then incentivized by, is like how well were their rankings basically based on.